Okay, look, I'm going to do two things. First of all, I'm going to deal with the immediate crisis, the load shedding. What are the prospects of getting out of that? And then secondly, I want to give a bit of a broad overview of where we're going. It is not good enough just to talk about what is the crisis. We also have to look at the road ahead and see whether there's a possibility of getting out. So the basic story on load shedding is very simple. We have load shedding in South Africa because we produce 6,000 megawatts of baseload electricity too little, or 6,000 megawatts too few electricity, and that gap has to be filled. Now, what is baseload? Baseload simply means power that's available for 24 hours of the day, whether it's Sunday or Monday, middle of the day, middle of the night, whether it rains or not raining, the power must be available for 24 hours. That is baseload. Now, we're moving increasingly from an electricity system with baseload to a system where renewables play a role. Now, 1 megawatt of renewables is not the same as 1 megawatt of baseload. You will agree with me, if the sun shines, it's all good, but if the sun doesn't shine, like it hasn't shone here in Johannesburg now for about 4 days, then my solar system that I have is not as effective as one would like it to be. So the ratio is more or less 3 to 1. If you have 1 megawatt of baseload, you need about 3 megawatts of renewable capacity to make up for that. And then, of course, you need the storage, you need in the form of batteries or whatever storage there is, and you have to make use of gas to fill in the gaps. But the basic point of this slide is simply we want to compare apples with apples. We need 6,000 megawatts of baseload, and that is equal to about 18,000 megawatts of renewables. So that's what the country needs if we want to stop load shedding. So what is in the pipeline at the moment? In fact, I'll go a little bit further and say not only what is in the pipeline, but what is being done at the moment and see where that brings us. First of all, the private sector, a variety of private sector projects, about 100 of them are busy installing capacity equal to 9,000 megawatts of renewables. And most of this is in the mining sector, about 6,000 megawatts, but the rest of the economy is also increasingly moving over to installing private installation of renewable energy. Then there is the government-led programs, which are known as the bid windows. We've had bid window 5 and bid window 6. They add up to about 2,800 megawatts. And here in these two graphs, you see a very important trend unfolding. And that is that the private sector and private sector installation is taking over from official or public sector installation. It's a very distinct difference, and it comes clearly out in the graph. If you add those two graphs together, or those two quantities together, you end up with about 11,800 megawatts, which is on the way to the 18,000 that we need over there. Then government plans to import 1,000 megawatts from our neighboring countries. They're already importing about 300 megawatts, and hopefully the other 1,000 can also be procured. Then government wants to do what happened in Vietnam and what happened in Germany, and that is you use the solar panels on top of private residence for electricity generation. Now, we don't know precisely how much capacity is available on rooftops, but the estimate is around about 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts, and the idea is to try and get 1,000 megawatts of that into the grid. Cape Town municipality, as you would know from media reports, has already started a scheme to buy power from private households and from private businesses, which can be fed into the grid, and they pay a certain tariff for that. In the case of Cape Town, 104 cents per kilowatt hour. Then a very innovative scheme that was started by Andre de Ruyter at Eskom is that you take the land which currently belongs to Eskom around the current coal-fired power stations. They've got big tracts of land. Take that land, and while the power station is running, you lease the land out to private entrepreneurs to come and put up renewable plants. The Ruyter's argument is more or less the following. He says, look, clearly the Northern Cape, the Western Cape, the Eastern Cape, are the best in the country when it comes to solar, but Mpumalanga, where all Eskom's power stations are, coal-fired power stations are, has got more sunshine than Germany. So why can't you have renewable plants there as well? And this process has started. 2,000 megawatts are expected to be generated through this system by private people who can then sell the power to whoever they want to. They don't even have to sell it to Eskom. Eskom, of course, creates an extra income stream. They rent the land out, they lease the land out to the private people who've got to pay a rent. And transmission connection is not a problem. There's a power station there at the moment. There's a transmission grid. All you do is take the renewable and plug it into the transmission grid. It's an innovative scheme and a very decisive one in terms of tilting the country over. Then Eskom has got, they have already developed a standard offer of purchase, which is busy going through the official processes of authorization. And essentially what it means is that they will pay a standard price for electricity and they will do it on 1 or 2 days forward basis. Now, this is a very important step if you want to develop a market in electricity. We have a market in all kinds of things in South Africa, in fruit, in bread, in milk, in cell phone usage, but we don't have a market in electricity. And that is something that is busy changing, and the standard offer of purchase will fill into that. Now you can see that we are approaching the 18,000 megawatts that we need to stop load shedding in South Africa. And the last piece of the puzzle here is a coal-fired station, Medupi, which if you take the one unit that will still come onto line, unit number 6, I think it is, it'll come onto line in the course of this year. That will, you can multiply that with 3, and it will give you, we compare apples with apples, it will give you 2,283 megawatts, and that will push us over the 18,000 megawatt line. Now, Winston Churchill used to say that he doesn't understand graphs. All he knows is one line crosses another. It's important. And I think the fact that the red line crosses the brown line on the graph tells the story. Can I just say something about Medupi? There is a narrative out there that Medupi and Kusile are complete failures. That is not correct. It's a bit of a myth. Kusile is a failure, absolutely, and that's why I don't provide anything on this graph here to come from Kusile. Government does provide a lot in their planning. I have just ignored it. And the reason I've ignored it is because I spend time with Eskom engineers on the ground. And I'm happy to say that I will not bring Kusile into this for the short term. Medupi, however, is a very, very different story. Medupi has got 5 units running at the moment, and they're running at the energy availability factor of over 85%. It's a significant performance. That's what you would expect from a new plant, which Medupi is, and it's very reasonable to expect that the last unit to come online will also operate at that level. The man in charge there is an engineer, Mr. Zweli Witboy. He's been with Eskom for 22 years. He came through the ranks, and he's clearly running the station properly, in complete contrast to Kusile. So if I can leave this one thought with you in your discussions and listening to people talking, and people talk a lot about this issue, do not take seriously a statement that bracket Medupi and Kusile together. They are not the same. They've got very different performance levels. And again, so this is how we're going to deal with the 6,000 megawatts that are causing load shedding in South Africa. How long will it take to implement these things? I'm saying it will take 2 years. And I've been saying this since last year already. I think we will have load shedding until the end of 2024. I also think then it will be over. And I'm happy to informally, I run a betting bet here. I'm happy to say that by 30 June 2025, load shedding in South Africa will be over. If you don't believe me, please take the bet. The bet price is 1 case of South African red wine. Okay, so this gives you a feel for what's being done to deal with the load shedding, the different areas, and you can follow it to yourselves through media reports. and my timeline for this is about 2 years. Government's timeline is a bit shorter. They're talking about 18 months. I think they're pushing it a bit. I'm more comfortable to talk about December 2024. Right. We all know that bid window 6, which was supposed to be concluded in December, was concluded, but it was a huge disappointment. Of the 4,200 megawatts that were supposed to be procured through bid window 6, only 1,000 was procured. So it was a big disappointment. It was, in fact, a bit of a disaster. Why did that happen? Because it transpired that there's not enough grid capacity in the country to connect all the people who submitted bids. There was no shortage of bids. There was no shortage of bids. In fact, the auction was something like 2 or 3 times oversubscribed. So clearly, a lot of people are keen. A lot of investors and business people are keen to get into the South African renewable energy story, but there was not sufficient capacity on the grid. So what will be done about the extending the grid in the next 2 years? At the moment, if you just look at this slide and follow the cursor, then at the moment our grid is developed to take power from this part of the country here, Mpumalanga and Limpopo, to the rest of the country. So it comes from the northeast to the southwest. What clearly needs to happen now is you have to create more transmission capacity there, and you also have to try and push more transmission capacity in the southwestern part of the country, Eastern Cape, Western Cape, and Northern Cape, because here the grid is full. The projects that we currently have taken up all the connection space here. How much will these 16,600 megawatts of transmission cost? It will cost about 72 billion rand. There you can see the detail of what is involved in creating the 16,500 megawatts of extra transmission. Where will the money come from? Well, the president has already made a pronouncement on that. South Africa is getting, under the Just Economic Transition Investment Plan, which was approved at COP27 last year, December last year, South Africa is going to get 131 billion rand from mainly international, but also local finance to expand the grid. And the president has already committed that that money will be prioritized through the grid. So you should be able to cover the 72 billion fairly easily with the 131 billion. There's of course a lot of detail behind this, and I'm happy to answer any queries about that. But between the expansion of the grid and the generation that's taking place at the moment, this is how I see the picture being resolved over the next 2 years. So load shedding will be with us for 2 years, that we must accept. The question is, what then? Can things improve after that? And that's where I would like to go now. One of the problems that we have in South Africa, and it's a worldwide problem, is that we have a tendency to focus on that which is happening now. And we take the now and we make that permanent as if that is the eternal truth forever. And this was very well summarized by a journalist himself, Will Emmett. He ended his career as the editor of The Economist. You don't really get much more senior than that in the world of journalism. And he made this point about journalists and also what he called the instant analyst. The journalist, like the instant analyst, is constantly at the risk of overestimating the short term and underestimating the longer term. What I want to do now is, I've dealt with the short term, we've dealt with load shedding. I would now like to focus the attention on the longer term, or what I call the longer view. Now let's just stand back and say, why are we where we are? We are where we are because the Eskom efficiency, as measured by the electricity availability factor, EAF, has declined consistently since 2005. There you can see the detail. You see the slide. It was developed by Clyde Mallinson, an energy analyst and a good person on electricity. This is his work, not my work. But the work is quite striking. And there you can see the trend line. And you can see what his prediction was early in last year, already he said that we will be lucky if we make 2022 with an electricity availability factor of 51%. The number for 2022 is not available yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is, if not 51, it's certainly not going to be 55. But you can clearly see the target which was set for Eskom management to do 60%. Let's take the 60% line for 2022. There you can see the gap. It is a nonsense target. And the target that politicians and in fact also the board members are talking about of returning Eskom to 70 or 75%, I think it's a dangerous game to play. It's a dangerous game to play because if you not make it, you create distrust and you create disillusionment. Politicians who talk about they can fix Eskom in 12 months, I'm afraid they don't know what they're talking about. Now, why did this happen? It happened because over time, that's what my engineering contacts at Eskom tell me, people on the ground. What happened over time was that maintenance budgets have been cut. Traditionally, Eskom was an engineering company. The engineers called the shots. And if the engineers said they wanted 100 Rand for maintenance, they got 100 Rand. Starting in 2010, which is over here, the financial director of Eskom at the time, Paul O'Flaherty, he later on became the CEO of ArcelorMittal, started cutting maintenance budgets. That was in 2010, over here. Now, of course, if you cut a maintenance budget, you don't see the impact immediately, but you cannot deny the impact over time. And then in 2015, Anoy Singh became the financial director, and he cut the maintenance budgets by 15 billion Rand. And again, you don't necessarily see it immediately. There's 2015. You in fact saw a little bit of an uptick there, which is more to do with short-term measures and over time. But if you sit here and you're the CFO, then you say, oh, look, I took the right decision. I cut 15 billion out of expense, but our efficiencies, in fact, are going up. But of course, that's a bit of a mirage, and you can see how the thing came down. So that's the essentialia of what happened. Maintenance was not maintained, and because maintenance was not done, you now sit with a fleet, a coal fleet. I don't know why the electricity people talk about power stations as a fleet, but that's the jargon, and I follow the jargon. We sit with power stations that are really not up to the job. Now, as part of taking a long-term view, I like to do timelines. A timeline is a fantastic thing. First of all, our memories are short, we don't remember. Secondly, when you put a lot of things together, the answer jumps at you from the page. You don't have to speculate, you don't have to wonder, the answer comes to you from the page. And what I want to do here on this page is to say when load shedding started, and it started in October 2007. Some people say load shedding started in 2008, that's not correct. The first one was October 2007. And then what we did in response to it. And we basically had three responses to load shedding. The first response actually came before load shedding started. Load shedding started in October, but 5 months earlier, in May 2007, the builders, the engineers and contractors went on site and the building at Medupi started. Now, if you want to start in May, it means that you're planning and getting the finances in order and doing the technical feasibilities and so on, predate that construction start by at least 3 or 4 years. All right. So I mentioned this because a lot of people walk around, friends of mine, and they say, we had load shedding and nothing was done. That's not quite correct. That's not quite correct. Before load shedding started, Medupi was already very far advanced. And in fact, it was not just Medupi, it was also Kusile. 10 months after load shedding started in 2007, 10 months later in August 2008, the contractors went on site at Kusile. So those two power stations are, as you know, the biggest in their sort, in their category, in the Southern Hemisphere. It is a very strong response to energy shortage. Will we today, in 2022, again build a coal-fired power station? No, we won't. And in that sense, you can say that it was a mistake to do that. We should have looked at other options. But those are the decisions that the authorities of the time, also the Eskom authorities, took. Then in 2011, we had a third response to load shedding, and that is South Africa started with its IPP program, or Independent Power Producers Program. This program was recognized worldwide as highly efficient, highly successful, and corruption-free, and that is still the case. So you had three responses: two coal-fired power stations, big ones, and the start of our IPP program. So how did we fumble it? How did we fumble it? Well, we all know what happened at Medupi and Kusile. The state capture report from Judge Zondo tells us, and a million other sources tell us as well. They went way over budget. Corruption was rife. Wrong designs were used. It was just a fumbling, and I can use another word with F, which is a bit stronger. What happened with the renewable power program is that in 2015, Brian Molefe refused to sign 27 IPP contracts. And his argument was that they were too expensive. Now, maybe they were, in fact, they were expensive, but Eskom passed that cost on to the consumer. So Eskom didn't carry the cost. That's false. The consumer carried the cost. But what you did by starting with IPPs, you established a new industry. And the cost has come down by about 10 times. The first contracts were signed at R4.50 per kilowatt hour. The price in the latest bid window was sitting at about 48 cents. So from R4.50 to 48 cents, that's a huge decline. And that's what happened with new technologies. We know that, and that is the part of creating any new industry. Now, just back to our timeline, we got load shedding in 2007. Then we had no load shedding for 7 years. That's very important. We had no load shedding for 7 years. In March 2014, we again got load shedding. And in December of 2014, load shedding peaked at stage 3 or level 3, and we thought this was a big disaster. Now, why that 2015 decision by Brian Molefe is so absolutely devastating is there is research out by Meridian Economics, Groevier Steyn and his colleagues, that show very clearly that 91%, I'm going to say that again, 91% of stage 4 load shedding could have been avoided had we installed only 5,000 megawatts more renewable energy, not base load, just renewable. Now, by stopping the renewable program in 2015, Brian Molefe stopped that process of adding renewable megawatts, and it is contributing to no small extent to where we are now. So this timeline really tells you what was our response, and it tells you what went wrong. And already in 2015, a quarter of the year's calendar days, 27% of 365 days, we experienced load shedding. Not all at levels 3 or higher. Well, there was not higher. The highest was level 3 in December that year, but there was load shedding. So what am I trying to say with this slide? I want to give a longer term perspective. The statement that we did nothing is not true. We did 3 things, but we really fumbled all 3 things. The one through corruption and state capture, the other one for whatever reasons Mr. Molefe had to stop renewable contracts. But then a significant change came in 2018. Today, on Valentine's Day, 14 February 2018, Ramaphosa was elected as president of South Africa. So he's now been in office for 5 years, from 2018. Now, 6 weeks after he took power, the Ramaphosa government signed the 27 contracts which Brian Molefe suspended or stopped. The last megawatts from those 27 contracts were connected to the grid last year, 2022. And there you immediately see an interesting thing coming at you, jumping at you from the page. It takes time. These things you don't just flick your fingers and there's a project, and you flick your fingers and the project is completed, and you flick your fingers a third time and there's electricity connected to the grid. No, it takes time. You will see it in other places in this presentation as well. Secondly, Ramaphosa ran quite huge political risks. We now forget it, But at the time, there was high court applications all the way to the appeal court in Bloemfontein to stop the signature of those contracts. There were blockades. You may not know it, but up here in Gauteng, Tshwane, and the highway between Tshwane and the border post with Mozambique were blockaded a couple of times by coal lobbyists, coal people, coal truckers, and coal miners who said, by signing these IPP contracts, these renewable energy contracts, you're taking the bread out of our mouths. We are coal people. What will happen to us if we no longer use coal? So there was huge political resistance. There was also an election. There was also an election in May 2019. And in spite of that, the contracts were signed and implementation proceeded. That was, for me, ladies and gentlemen, a very early sign of where the Ramaphosa government was going on matters electricity. Most members of the chattering classes missed it. In fact, I think all of them missed it. Nobody picked it up and said, wait, we've seen a change here from the days of the Zuma government. Then in 2019, and as I've already said, there was an election in May 2019, Ramaphosa announced in the State of the Nation speech that Eskom will be broken up into 3. Quite a risky thing to do before an election. He gave the pledge that nobody will be retrenched. He was blamed for that. I think that's, in my view, pragmatic politics. And in any case, now 5 years later, what do we know about the staff numbers at Eskom? We know that they've declined by about 8% anyway, just through natural attrition and so on. So you don't have to spend your capital on things which can take care of themselves. And then in 2019, we got a very important government decision. It is called the Integrated Resource Plan, the IRP. And what is the key feature of the IRP? The key feature is that the digits 9 and 5 turn around from a situation where in 2019, 95% of our power, of our electricity came from coal. By 2030, that's the period to which the IRP runs, by 2030, that number would be 59. It's a huge change, make no mistake. And this was done by Gwedi Mantashe. So the narrative out there in the chattering classes that Gwedi is against renewables and so on, maybe he is, maybe he's not, I don't know. But what I do know, he published a long-term energy plan which provided for a switch from 95 to 59. It was a very important document. On the same day, in October, Pravin Gordhan published the Eskom roadmap. 2 documents were released on the same morning. And what was set out in that Eskom roadmap is that South Africa will develop a market in electricity. And what does a market in electricity mean? It simply means that just as you can choose whether you buy your milk from Pick n Pay or from Woolworths, or whether you buy your meat from Woolworths or a local butcher, you will have a choice on where you can buy your power. But just as you have many fruit producers or many butchers and meat producers, you will also have many power producers that will feed into the market, and you can go into the marketplace, negotiate what you want at a price that satisfies both parties. It's a big thing. We haven't had that in South Africa ever. We've got a 100-year history of electricity provision, even longer, about 130, 40 years, but we've never had a market. So this was quite a big change that was announced. And if you look at the IRP and the Eskom roadmap published on the same morning, then you can clearly see where the politicians were going. Now, this whole process was, of course, I think, given impetus by the fact that in December 2019, beginning of December, the country experienced stage 6 load shedding for the first time. So while all these good policy decisions were made, and while politics certainly made a big shift in how they look at the electricity industry, the reality on the ground, the reality of the energy availability factor, the reality of old equipment and bad maintenance, poor maintenance over a long time was pushing things on the ground quicker or faster than what the policymakers could keep up with. So good work done, but not fast enough to deal with that graph that I showed you of declining energy availability. Now, I don't want to say that load shedding is a good thing for South Africa. That I'm clearly not saying, but what I am saying is that load shedding is forcing a change. The crisis is forcing a change, which otherwise would probably not have happened, or would have taken at least another 10 years. And what is that change? Well, it is exactly what I've just described. We move from a government monopoly, where there's only one provider called Eskom, and they effectively provide all the electricity in the country, centralized, monopoly, state-owned, to a system where electricity is a free market, where many producers can come in and consumers can choose from who they want to buy. It's really a big change in South Africa's electricity setup. Next month, March, it'll be 100 years since Hendrik van der Bijl started Eskom. And I have a very high regard for Van der Bijl. I think he was one of the great South Africans. He died in 1948, but between 1923 and 1948, about a quarter of a century, he basically built up what we today know as Eskom. He also built a few other things, but Eskom was one of them. But I think the reality is that the house that Van der Bijl built is no longer fit for purpose. You will nowhere in the world find another electricity utility like Eskom. The whole world, from China to the Netherlands, from America to New Zealand, have moved away from the integrated utility model that Van der Bijl built for South Africa. Times change, technology changes. That's a big one. Cost changes, cost pressures change, and therefore your institutions must evolve to keep up with that. And I think that is what load shedding is doing in South Africa. Look at this slide. Remember now, we got, there we are, we got stage 6 load shedding in December 2019. In August 2020, Gwedi Mantashe went out with a tender for 2,000 megawatts of emergency power. That's where the infamous power ship transaction comes in for about 1,200 megawatts. The other 800 megawatts was renewables, and of those 800 megawatts, about 540 have already been, or is in the process of being connected to the grid. The argument is about the 1,200 megawatts from a diesel ship, a diesel power ship. In October 2020, government changed the regulations to allow municipalities to buy power. Cape Town municipality was quick out of the blocks. They said they were going to do it. It's now 2 years and 3 or 4 months later, and Cape Town municipality has still not produced 1 megawatt of power, or procured rather 1 megawatt of power. Now, I think Cape Town municipality is probably one of the best run in the country. So why is the best run municipality circling so long? Why are they circling so long to get going with something that they want to do? There's no ideological debate, there's no political debate. Well, it goes to the point that I made earlier, that these things take time. You don't just snap your fingers and there's a contract, and you snap your fingers and it's built. You snap your fingers and it's connected. And I think the DA in Cape Town has learned that lesson in a hard way, as the rest of the country is also learning. They now have a tender rate, I think, for 300 megawatts of power, but the tender has not been allocated yet. So it takes time. In their case, good people, committed people, took them more than 10 years, and they still don't have a megawatt of power. I don't want to knock them, don't get me wrong. I don't want to knock them. But I'm trying to illustrate the difficulty of the process. Now, in April 2021, Bid Window 5 was launched. In June 2021, the president went on television and he lifted the cap below which you do not need a license from NERSA, from 1 megawatt to 100 megawatts. It was a truly important decision. In April, a year later, a year after the first one, Bid Window 6 was launched. I've already spoken about the fact that transmission tripped that one and is in a big disappointment. Then in July, again, because of load shedding in the country, the president went on television again, and he now lifted the 100 megawatt cap as well. A year after he lifted it from 1 to 100, he now simply abolished it. And there was also a range of other issues that I'm not going to discuss. In October, Andre de Ruyter announced the repurposing of Eskom land. Clearly, he must have had political backing for that. Otherwise, it wouldn't have happened. And I'm happy to say that in January this year, last month, A further, I think 500 hectares of land was put out by Eskom to tender. Clearly, the Rater is pushing this agenda before he leaves office. And that genie is out of the bottle. That genie is out of the bottle. It's not going to go back into the bottle. And then in December, South Africa's Just Economic Transition Plan was accepted at COP27, which was held in Egypt. And the Western countries have committed themselves to a huge amount of money to finance this. Not just Western countries, but also Western NGOs. Jeff Bezos, for example, the Amazon man, he's got a private NGO which specializes in matters environmental. They are one of the NGOs that's making money available. So is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and others. What I really want to draw your attention to are these two. What you see on the screen are two processes of procuring power. The one is the official government process run by Gwede Mantashe and the Department of Mineral and Energy Affairs. They did the 2,000 megawatts emergency. They changed the rules for the municipalities, which is basically part of government. They had bid window 5, bid window 6. Those two decisions by the president to lift the cap has opened the floodgates for private sector involvement. It has really opened the floodgates, where in the past the private sector had to wait sometimes up to 3 years to get all their ducks in a row. Well, no, not to get their ducks in a row, to get all the ducks through the official approval steps. That was lifted by the president's two announcements. And that explains what happened in bid window 6. The private sector people who are busy with projects put down a deposit with Eskom to get what is called a budget quote, and that secures them a place on the transmission grid. So many of them are busy with projects and have put down a deposit at Eskom that they took out all the capacity on the grid. Now, that is something that we must look at. We must find some kind of a balance between public and private procurement. But I think what will happen in due course is the public procurement will simply fall by the wayside. The procurement system we have in South Africa for electricity is like Eskom, old-fashioned. It is very dirigist, it's very static, it's very statist, and just as Eskom is on its way out, in the same sense that procurement system is on its way out. You can just look at the legislation that has been published for comment and for submission to Parliament. So what the slide tells us, it captures over time two processes, the one a public process, the one a private process. You can clearly see, if you look at the numbers, the private process is much quicker, much more efficient, and is bringing many more megawatts to the national supply. Now, what I want to illustrate, if you have a situation where private companies are busy with 9,000 megawatts, there's no limitation on what they can do, they don't have to jump through all the loops. One of two things must happen. Either there will be a lot of investment of people who see this as an opportunity to make money, or people will ignore it. What we see so far is that it's not being ignored. What we see so far is an enormous response from people to bid window 5, that was oversubscribed about 3 times, bid window 6, that was oversubscribed about 3 times. The fact that both these bid windows, in the end, allocated contracts to much less than the bid window. In the case of bid window 6, as I've already said, the size was 4,200 megawatts, only 1,000 was allocated, because there's no more space on the transmission grid. Why is there no more space on the transmission grid? Because private sector companies was the quickest to get to the grid, put down a deposit, and secure a place on the grid. And this adds up. You see, it adds up to the enormous process of new investment. Forget about the 6,000 megawatts that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. But you probably know, and if you don't know, it's very useful to know, that Eskom by 2030, in other words, over the next 8 years, have to decommission 10,000 megawatts of baseload. And then after 2030, a further 12,000 megawatts of baseload. That's 22,000 megawatts. Now, Eskom's theoretical installed capacity, not that they produce that much, but their theoretical installed capacity is 44,000. 22,000 megawatts is half of that. It's 50%. That is what's going to disappear out of the Eskom generation fleet. To make it practical, 8 of 14 coal-fired power stations are going to close down over the next 10, 11 years. It used to be 9 out of 15, but the first one, Komati, closed down on 31 October last year already. So there are now 14 left, and of those 14, 8 will have to close down over the next 10 to 12 years. You've got to replace it. And the cost of replacing it will come to an investment of 1.5 trillion rand. In the South African economy, that is a very, very big number. It is really a big number. What will it be invested in? It'll be invested in generation, excuse me, renewables, but also gas. After 2030, remember this 1.5 trillion only runs to 2030. After that, the number will increase many times. After that, I would expect nuclear to become part of the process, but I don't see that happening before 2030. Maybe feasibilities and tenders and so on. But in any case, the 1.5 trillion does not include nuclear. You have to spend money on storage. Those of you who read the Business Day this morning would have seen the World Bank report. You have to upgrade the grid. We've already spoken about that. And you've got a fixed distribution in municipalities. And in Mpumalanga, you have to do something about the people who lose out the process of just transition. Now, the key point to take home here is that this 1.5 trillion, virtually, not virtually, all of it will come from the private sector, either the private sector as in private sector or the private NGO sector. In other words, people outside governments. I think some money, especially for just transition, will come from the South African government budget, but the rest of those items, storage, new generation capacity, grid upgrading, and so on, will come from other sources. And this is an extremely important point, and people sometimes struggle to embrace this point. But just think of cell phone companies. 25 years ago, we had landlines. We had Telkom. Here in this house where I'm staying in Johannesburg, we had to wait 6 months to get a landline connection from Telkom. Today, you walk into a shop, you buy a cell phone, you connect it. It's a complete revolution that has taken place in telephony. And none of that revolution in telephony was paid for by the taxpayer. None of it. Private companies did it. Vodacom, MTN, Cell C, and so on and so forth. Now, the same process will play out in electricity. What happened in the telephone industry is going to happen or is happening already in the electricity industry. So don't be intimidated by that big number of 1.5 trillion. It's money that is already coming into the country. There's huge interest from foreigners for investment, and there's equally huge interest from South Africans. This story that many people have in the chattering classes, I'm trying to think of a good translation of the term chattering classes. En ek dink klets 'n klasse, seker die beste wat daar is. And this thing of the klets and the klasse, or the chattering classes, that South Africa is not investable and so on. Well, the experience in electricity is certainly belying that completely and totally. Before COVID, the numbers are a bit lower now. We still have to get back to where we were before COVID. But before COVID, South Africa's gross investment came to about 900 billion a year. Now, 900 billion a year, ladies and gentlemen, if you divide it by 12 months, 75 billion a month. If you divide a month by 30 days, you end up with 2.5 billion rand a day, every day of the month. Sunday, Saturday, public holiday, whether you're on leave, at work, it's 2.5 billion a day. 2.5 billion rand a day divided by 24 hours is 104 million rand per hour. Just think about that for a moment. In how many hours will this seminar last this morning, this webinar? For every hour, 104 million rand is being invested into the economy. So this story about South Africa not being an investment destination is clearly not in line with the truth. Of course, one always wants more, but that's a different argument from saying there's nothing. So electricity is playing a big, big role. And then last year, I treated myself and my wife, and we went on a tour of the West Coast, went all the way up to Boegoebaai. I wanted to see Boegoebaai. It's about 60 kilometers north of Port Nolloth. Now, there's, of course, nothing at the moment, but Boegoebaai is going to become the centerpiece. A new harbor will be built, the railway line is going to become the centerpiece of hydrogen production in South Africa. And you can't see it when you stand on the beach there, little hill there, and you look out over it. You can't see it, but about 100 meters or so into the ocean, the escarpment falls away. And that makes it ideal for a deep sea harbor. This is all part of hydrogen. Now, we're not talking about hydrogen this morning, but that is certainly coming. You know, ask yourself the question, why did Chancellor Scholz of Germany, why did he fly 11 hours to Pretoria, have a 24-hour state visit, and then fly 11 hours back to Berlin? You know, even the Luftwaffe can't fire faster than 11 hours. So why spend 22 hours for a 24-hour visit? Traveling 22 hours for a 24-hour visit. He came to South Africa to sign a memorandum of understanding with the South African government and with Sasol on developing hydrogen, which can be exported to Germany. It's in the middle of the Ukraine crisis. They've got energy problems. It focused the mind. And in the midst of that crisis, he came here to try and get partners to invest and to work on hydrogen. So we're not talking about hydrogen today, but that's a further thing coming down the line, quite apart from what renewables and the change in our current electricity system will bring. Now, let me move towards the end and say that this country was built by diamonds and gold. If we didn't discover diamonds at Kimberley, and if we didn't discover gold in the Witwatersrand, South Africa wouldn't be the sophisticated, diverse economy that it is. It's just a fact of history. But we had it, and we used it. Some would say wisely, some would say unwisely. We dug up all the diamonds, there's not much left in Kimberley, and we dug up all the gold, there's not much left in gold. But what is clearly the new diamond, and clearly the new gold deposits, is renewable energy. There's no question about that. We've got fantastic quantities of sunshine, fantastic quantities of wind, which is very irritating for tourists in December, but very good for the renewable energy field. And I'm brave to say that green is going to become the new gold and will launch this country on a completely different path. So what will this country's energy system look like 10, 11 years from now, roughly by 2034? Or as I put it on the screen, what is the future beyond load shedding? We're back to instant analysis and longer term view, overestimating the short term, underestimating the long term. So what can the long term look like? Eskom, as we know, it will disappear. It will separate into 3 companies, generation and distribution. I've already told you that about half its current coal-fired power stations would have ceased to exist by 2033, 2034. More will close down after 2034, but taking it up to that date. Gas and nuclear will be added to the Eskom generation. Gas, certainly, there's already a tender out for that, for a plant in Richards Bay. And when you have renewables, wind and sun, you need gas to fill in the gaps. When the sun doesn't shine, there's no power. Well, how do you run a factory? How do you run an office? How do you run irrigation? And the idea, gas, the big benefit of gas is dispatchable. You can switch it on and off. You can't switch a coal plant on and off. You can't switch a nuclear plant on and off. Gas you can. I have gas here in Johannesburg. I live in an old part of Joburg where there is still what is called street gas, was installed way back in the 1930s. And when it's cold here in Joburg, or it rains as it has, simply switch it on, and there's your fireplace, and you can enjoy the heat. So you need gas as a supplement for renewables. I know the green Taliban doesn't like it. They are vociferously against gas, but they must also get over themselves and accept the reality of life. Industrial scale batteries will play a huge role. It's already started. In the very small, minuscule solar system I have here, I have 5 batteries already, and that helps to carry me through load shedding. Multiply that by many times. For a big business like an irrigation farm or a fruit factory or any big company. The transmission company has already been formed. It will be taken out of Eskom as soon as the arrangement with the creditors have been finalized. In fact, the contract has already been signed between the National Transmission Company and Eskom, and it is subject to conditions precedent. And one of those conditions, the big one, is that the creditors of Eskom must agree to the separation. At the moment, the creditors have got a claim against the whole of Eskom. When you have a separate transmission company, claim will only be against that company, and you'll have to satisfy the creditors. It is the biggest corporate restructuring South Africa has seen. When Old Mutual went to London, when Old Mutual came back, was a big story. Investec went to London, split up, and so on. People talked about it. It took about 5-6 years. Huge excitement. Old Mutual and Investec restructuring is nothing in comparison to the Eskom restructuring. So the fact that we have come quite a long way in 4 years, the president announced it in 2019, it's now February 2023, they've come quite a long way in 4 years, and we should, in a period of 5 years from the beginning, 5 years from 2019, we should have the separate company in place. And essentially, I've already said it to you, what will be the case in 2034 is that you will buy power from a multitude of different generating companies, and you will sell it to distributors and end users. There are already companies doing precisely that. There's one hospital group in the country that has put 50 of its hospitals will be provided by a non-Eskom supplier with energy whenever there's load shedding. There's a big shopping center here in Johannesburg that buys their power from Johannesburg Metro, but they get about 30% of their power from an alternative supplier at a much cheaper price. So their overall price that they pay for power is lower than what it would have been had they bought everything from the Metro. Can I just say on this point, ladies and gentlemen, I think there are many myths and many phrases that I used, and one phrase which is completely abused is the phrase going off the grid. Nobody is going off the grid. You go off the grid for 30% or 20% or 50% of what you need, but you still need to be connected to the grid for the remainder. If you want to take an ordinary middle-class house like this one off the grid, I would have to buy 2 other houses next to me to have the roof space to put up enough solar to take this house off the grid. It's a completely misused term. And I must say, I get irritated by people who just throw it around. So you will have alternative energy suppliers, apart from what you yourself generate, but they won't necessarily be Eskom. That's the important point. Other people will take the place of a huge part of the Eskom production. And then the big change that is still on its way, it hasn't hit us yet, but it will hit us, is distribution. If you see generation as the factory where you generate something, you see transmission as from the factory gate to the distributor, to the retailer, and you see the retailer as distribution, they sell to the public. It is the same here. Distribution is basically the retail sector of electricity, and what we're going to see is the creation of micro and mini grids. In this street here, I can link up with my neighbors and we can supply power to one another. Those of us who have power systems and sell it to your next door neighbor who needs the power. That is the way the technology is going, and that technology will get implemented in a big way. So I want to conclude with my favorite question that I always ask, so what? What does all these things mean? A lot of information, a lot of words, what does it mean? The first one is there's a radical reform process going on in electricity. It's not just load shedding. There's a whole new world beyond load shedding. And the second point that clearly come out of it, as much as we are now in a crisis, and we are, nobody's arguing about that. We are in a crisis, and nobody will know it better than irrigation farmers. As much as we are now in a crisis, it absolutely creates the possibility of an entirely different future. I repeat what I've already said. We will have load shedding until the end of 2024. By mid-2025, it'll be over. Why will it be over? Because money is flowing into it. It's as simple as that. There's huge amounts of investment, and with investment, new technology, new expertise going into the sector. People walk around always with nonsense ideas. people in the chattering classes, and then they say, oh, I've talked to a Zimbabwean, and the Zimbabwean told me, what I'm seeing now in South Africa, I saw in Zimbabwe 20 years ago, you're going the same direction. All fine, there's only one little problem. Zimbabwe did not embark on a massive investment program in a new industry. As the industry collapsed, they just left it. I think they're now busy putting up a solar farm, and they're trying to move into renewable energy now, but it's way below what they need. So the point of the story is, if money goes into a sector in huge amounts, it transforms the sector, and it transforms the efficiency and productivity of the sector. We're busy building a whole new electricity system. The main thing is that we replace a government monopoly called Eskom with a competitive market. We're replacing a centralized system with a decentralized system. It's horrible that you're in a situation where if something goes wrong at one place, the whole country suffers. That is, you want to get out of that situation. It's a point that the president has repeatedly made. We're busy developing a market so that you can buy and sell electricity. And when there's a price and there's a buying and a selling, then you can have more investment. And I think you must keep your eyes open for changes in distribution in the next few years. The bottom line is, the more the current, call it state system collapses, the more it will be replaced, or at least supplemented by the private sector. I think that's the point to take away. And that holds the real possibility of economic revival